Estamos ao vivo?
Eu compartilhei, vamos ver. Espero que esteja ao vivo. Então a gente está falando para os nada aqui. Estamos ao vivo, sim.
Tá, beleza.
Então, gente, já tem gente chegando. Deixa eu encontrar aqui direitinho onde é que a gente está. Então, pessoal, estamos ao vivo. Então, boa noite, sejam bem-vindos à quinta edição da nossa série de lives Arqueologia das Mídias One-on-One. Dessa vez, eu, Márcio Teles e o Gustavo Fischer vamos receber um convidado internacional muito especial, Peter Krapp. Enfim, essa é a última live desse ano, dessa primeira temporada. A gente gostou muito de fazer esse programa, digamos, né, Gustavo? Mas, enfim, exploramos aí um pouco das prerrogativas, das bases epistemológicas da arqueologia das mídias, bases práticas também, metodológicas. Depois exploramos em 2 episódios com o Marcelo Conter e com a Thaís Aragão um pouco da arqueologia das mídias em relação ao áudio, à música, e agora a gente vai fechar um pouco explorando o audiovisual com o Peter. E voltaremos na próxima semestre, acreditamos, com um programa bacana também. Acho que vamos tentar fechar, talvez tematicamente, né, Gustavo? Ainda temos que conversar a respeito, mas acho que dá para fazer algumas coisas bem legais. Bom, enfim.
Com certeza.
Eu vou passar para o Gustavo apresenta o Peter e vocês podem comentar, escrever qualquer coisa ali no chat, da oi, da bom dia, curtir nossa página da Escola de Comunicação, curtir o LabMan lá do Gustavo também, né, do TECAB, e vão deixando seus comentários, a gente vai conversando com o Peter daqui a pouquinho. Por favor, Gustavo, apresente o nosso convidado especial, vai lá, eu estou me enrolando aqui.
Tá bom, Márcio, obrigado. Aproveitar já desde já agradecer essa parceria que a gente está tendo esse ano e saudar todo mundo que está nos assistindo. Meu nome é Gustavo Fischer, eu sou professor na Unicinos, programa de pós-graduação em comunicação, e muito satisfeito, muito feliz de estar aqui hoje recebendo o professor Peter Krapp, que já esteve conosco por 2 oportunidades na Unicinos, em 2018 e em 2020. Ele conseguiu estar conosco ali na Unicinos um pouquinho antes do mundo virar de cabeça para baixo. E é muito legal poder contar com ele hoje para conversar conosco nessa perspectiva mídia arqueológica sobre as questões concernentes a esse passado presente das videoconferências que hoje tanto fazem parte das nossas rotinas, né? Para quem ainda não conhece, o professor Peter Krapp, ele é professor de Film and Media Studies na Universidade da Califórnia, em Irvine. Ele é autor de vários livros, entre eles Déjà Vu, Aberrations of Cultural Memory, de 2004, e Noise Channels, Delete and Error in Digital Culture, de 2011, e o futuro Feedback, Reading Game Industry Circuits. O Peter também é músico, jornalista, web designer, tem alguns sites premiados nos anos 90, e segundo consta, ele consegue imitar os sons de um modem. E a gente vai conversar com o Peter, que está lá então na Califórnia, em Irvine, nesse dia tão especial para a gente em função dessa última live também, né, coincidindo aí com um dia eleitoral nos Estados Unidos também. O Peter, ele vai fazer no início uma apresentação, ele tem alguns slides para trazer esse conteúdo dele, e a partir daí a gente vai também dar sequência ao nosso debate, mas ao longo disso tudo vocês podem ir comentando e tal, e a gente também vai procurando, né, enfatizar o clima dialógico aí do nosso trabalho. Peter, thank you very, very much for being with us today. I know you are very interested in US elections / European Champions League. Of course, 2 very important subjects this year. And thank you very much for being available for us to have this talk regarding Zoom and all the other devices that we can look in a retrospective approach. So please, you can start at any point and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you both for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this series live on Facebook. And I hope that everybody can follow my English with a European accent, and that the slides and short clips I'm going to show don't get caught in any kind of transnational policing of Zoom content. Like all of us who are now working with and through video conferencing solutions, I've become curious not just about what's they make possible and how they allow us to keep working, but also what their media discursive formation is. So a few slides about media archaeology of video conferencing solutions and their various illustrations. I think I'm sharing the screen. If something doesn't work, you'll let me know. So I'm calling this presentation Beyond the Cool Obscure because sometimes when we talk about media archaeology as a challenge to media history or timelines, etc., it seems like media archaeology is just a sort of a way of fetishizing otherwise ignored or obscure or forgotten artifacts. That's not really the intention. I think if we're going to look at video conferencing in a media archaeological kind of mode, not necessarily to pick a fight with media historians or with historians of communication, although there could be some interesting fights about dubious consolations of timelines. But it's just to point out that the current Zoom boom doesn't happen out of nothing, doesn't come from nowhere. And to point out that after the fact, now that we are here in this situation where Microsoft Teams or Zoom or Jitsi or FaceTime or Messenger or Skype seem to be the only way that we can communicate with people for work, for class, for private parties, poolside, like those people homeworking behind me. It seems like everybody, after the fact, with hindsight, always already knew that technology is going to get us to this point. And I think that's deeply misleading. So the quotes here I have up on my slide kind of illustrate that the idea that technology has a natural direction, naturally leads to a certain kind of endpoint, it's easy to make fun of, right? So IBM chairman Thomas Watson in 1943 estimated the world market for computers at maybe 5. John von Neumann, a very influential mathematician, instrumental in inventing the digital computer, argued in 1949 that we have reached the limits of what's possible with computer technology, although that might end up seeming like a silly statement 5 years later. Went through the slides way too quickly. Ken Olsen predicted that there's no reason for individuals to have computers in their homes, only in 1977. Bill Gates in 81 argued that 650K of memory ought to be enough memory for anybody. Bob Metcalfe, a networking pioneer, argued that the internet will catastrophically collapse in 96. In an article about these kinds of wrong predictions in the MIT Technology Review, it was pointed out that the history of technology predictions should also be a resource to be mined for scholarship, not a pile of failed futurology to make fun of or to lampoon. But when we're curious about how this thing that we're doing right now, this kind of conversation slash lecture slash meeting working arrangement comes about, we can look at a couple of different phases that each contribute to the discursive formation that we are now working with and living with. One is the sci-fi history or prehistory. Science fiction famously predicts certain kind of technologies long before they have been rolled out for general use. Right? So, for instance, in 1927, Metropolis, the famous Fritz Lang movie, shows us a video conferencing system. 1927 is also the year that the Bell telephone system was able to send live television images of President Herbert Hoover over telephone lines from Washington, D.C. to an auditorium in Manhattan, in New York. That was the first public demonstration in the U.S. of long-distance video transmission. Sorry, Hoover was not president then. He was Secretary of Commerce. He was sort of part of the proof of concept for what we see here in science fiction gaze. Famously in Metropolis, you have an extreme class society that has everything to do with Feddersen, the stern master of the vast futuristic metropolis, the city of future of 2026. And in order to rule all that he surveys and to complete the image of a 21st century dystopia, he lives high above the rabble that he surveils. He's safely ensconced in one of these very high towers, but he's equipped with the latest wall-mounted, inexplicably paper-spouting video phone technologies. Right? So he can actually give commands and by the technicians down in the belly of the beast. And the technician here is talking back and says, if the machine is damaged and all hell can break loose, but the order is given. Feddersen in this scene appears to use 4 separate dials to arrive at the correct frequency for the call. So it's not a direct line connection. There seems to be a lot of options that he can call up. So he needs to use 2 frequencies to assign the correct call location, and then 2 smaller ones to provide some kind of fine-tuning of the video. And he picks up a video receiver with one hand and uses the other one to tap a rhythm on the panel that is relayed to the other phone and displayed as flashes of light to attract attention. So it's kind of like an idea that I can tap on your screen. I can alert you instead of ringing. I can tap on there and turn your screen on remotely. A similar scenario is presented in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. This is 1936, so it's barely a decade later. They're showing some factory surveillance. We don't need sound for this one. You can turn on the surveillance at any time, and you can likewise command technicians in the belly of the factory to make certain adjustments. Right? So the science fiction vision is very much a top-down, I surveil you, I find you, I give commands to you. And that is one value of the meaning of screens also in contemporary media culture that cannot be fully grasped without exploring antecedents and replacing them with the context of their own time. So if our approach is media archaeology, we're sort of excavating the past to shed light on the present, right? So we want to establish the present pastness of certain media constellations, and video conferencing is that kind of constellation. The PicturePhone is the actual technical implementation of what you mentioned, the Bell demonstration from 1927. The PicturePhone is sort of the actual built proof of concept that this is not just a science fiction idea. This is something that can be construed as a combination of television and telephone. There's a Bell Labs experimental model here on the magazine cover of Talk magazine, January 1957, that promises that you'll be able to get the picture. You know, this is not a video, it's just a representation, a screenshot, as it were, a picture of the person you're calling by dialing their number. A few years later, this is demonstrated at the World's Fair. It's going to be rolled out as a commercial service by Western Electric, part of the Bell Empire, crossing a telephone with a TV set. So it was developed in the 50s as a prototype consisting of a phone handset and a small TV. And one of the promises that I think resonates today in our multi-screen situation is advertising slogan, "One day you'll be a star." It promotes high-tech, futuristic communication devices that can enable people, that can empower people to be a star. At this point, art historians, media archaeologists are going to wonder, is this a confusion of different types of screens? Right? What is the screen that we're really talking about? Manovich, for instance, offered a historical classification of 3 different types of screens. There's a classical big screen that displays a static permanent image, for instance, a framed painting. There is secondly the dynamic screen that displays a moving image of the past. That's a cinema screen. And then there is the real-time screen, which shows the present. Obviously, Banovich here means the television screen, the radar screen, the computer screen, like real-time, at least a possibility for real-time display. But that kind of easy classification seems confusing. It's not as if we no longer have paintings because we have computer screens. It's not as if TV really competes directly with cinema, etc. So we got to be careful, especially if we're going to try to be seeing this from a media archaeological point of view. In the 19th century and even earlier, the word screen gained meanings that are about display and transmission of information already. The early references in the Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, from 1810 about transparent screens for the exhibition of a phantasmagoria. There are many visual media that use screens, whether they're still or moving images being used. And the origin of the small screen is similar. Erkki Huhtamo, for instance, proposed a whole study, media archaeological study of a screenology, of how do we derive the formulation, the discursive formation of small screens. But it's pretty clear that the idea of video conferencing, as we saw it in those 2 science fiction clips, was a cinematic idea. It was a large screen, like the whole wall. And it didn't go anywhere, but the small screen idea, initially the round display, that seemed to be technically much more feasible. And in the cultural imaginary, of course, television also had been invented, conceived long before the 1920s when it became technically implemented. The 20s were the decade of the first successful demonstrations and broadcasts. But the idea of seeing at a distance by means of a technological apparatus goes back at least to the late 18th century. So we have these screens that seem to promise commerce, that seem to promise communication, they seem to promise new forms of communication. And there, in the 20s and 30s, of course, the 2 competing ones. There's a mechanical TV receiver where the image is formed by means of a spinning disc. And then there is the electronic beginning of television. So, for instance, Western television's visionette from 1930, hidden inside of a sparsely decorated wooden cabinet. And here in the illustration, you have the idea of, home shopping with a similar kind of device that integrates into your home, but displays goods. So what the Bell demonstration wanted to get ready for the World Fair in 1964 was a system that integrated a camera, a screen, and a telephone with sufficient controls, including zoom, promising the ability to zoom in from a group to an individual, still using the screens that we know from cathode ray gun, cathode ray displays, etc. So the PicturePhone set from 1964 comes in this kind of oval design as an accessory to your phone line. Lets you see as well as hear. The idea here demonstrated by two engineers from an internal Bell publication, Meacham talking to Hall on their experimental PicturePhone. Both engineers helped develop the visual telephone system. They were very enthusiastic, the Bell engineers. They thought that the demonstrations that they had themselves at Murray Hill in New Jersey were highly promising. However, the more they talked to the public, especially at the World Fair in 1964, the more they realized that people love the idea of seeing the person they talk to, and they hate the idea of being seen by people while they're talking. Right? So that was just not something that they're comfortable with, harking back to that idea of surveillance, of the power of a roving eye, especially if you don't know how it turns on, when it turns on. So when in the 1964 World's Fair had the announcement of the PicturePhone service between New York City, Chicago, and Washington, they wanted to charge $21 for a 3-minute call, which is really, really expensive, even for that time. And that's on top of the hardware cost, installation cost of $500,000 for the PicturePhone itself. So it's not surprising that it didn't have a lot of customers, even though they came up with a different look. They offered a touch-tone control. They wanted to build out a network at least between 3 cities, New York, Washington, and Chicago, promising, again, the Zoom feature, which permits individual or group viewing, and banking on the idea that it could be subsidized for the early adopters, and then the more people buy in, the cheaper it becomes, and it kind of has a network effect. The more people you participate, the more it's going to be an accepted medium. So that's Metcalfe's law, the same Metcalfe who I was quoting in the beginning, who proposed that the value of a network is the square of its number of participants. Unfortunately, it turned out that the PicturePhone network in the 60s and even in the 70s and 80s remained very low value for customers. It was just way too expensive, both in the upfront investment and in the running costs. And the early adopters didn't convince people that it's a good idea, even though you see in the advertising for it all kinds of tropes. You can see your grandchildren, you can see your grandparents, you can have children communicate with their absent loved ones. You can have business calls that are expensive, but they're still less expensive than business travel, etc. All the same exact arguments that we've been getting the last 2 or 3 years for video conferencing and tele solutions for remote and distance education. The controls were really awkward. The picture was small. People were just not comfortable with being seen during a phone conversation. So you can just turn yourself off in Zoom now, and I can still have my background running and pretend that I'm not there, although you still hear me, I hope. AT&T was betting that they would get 3 in to their homes and offices, and maybe they're even projected revenues of up to 5 billion a year. It never happened. It was one of the most visible flops in telecommunication history. Here are some of the actual built prototypes. You see a control unit, a display unit, and a service unit. There's some fascinating innards that we could discuss if people are interested in that kind of thing. You know, what kind of power do you need? What kind of video in and out connections does it afford? All the way into the 90s, this stayed kind of the realm of a niche. You know, the world's first full-color motion video phone that worked over telephone lines in 1992, a complete flop. Nobody wanted it, even though by that time the cost had come down to a normal voice call. So it was pushed back into science fiction. We see it in 2001 Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick in 1968. We also see it in Blade Runner in 1982. It's still science fiction. By that time, it's been technically demonstrated and offered commercially for decades, and yet Ridley Scott still thinks it's appropriate to put that into a future vision, as you can see here in a brief clip that I'm playing of dialing up from the street, you know, with a simple phone number. Note that there is a little bit of a grid on the screen. He's requesting a conversation, and of course, famously, when she sees who it is, when she hears why he wants to talk to her, she doesn't want anything to do with him, and she basically hangs up on him, and he gets to see the bill. So just as if in many examples of this, people want to see who they talk to, they don't want to be seen. Now, a parallel history that I can't unfold completely, you know, to the history of screens is the history of the grid. Right? Going back to visual media and the instruction on perspective, all the way to Alberti and others, who were sort of using the grid to organize knowledge, to organize a visual field, to organize scholarship, to organize knowledge systems of all kinds, you know, from maps to surveys to architecture, all the way into surveillance systems. So today, if you know, we see each other on Zoom, on Teams, on any of the other video conferencing screens, it's basically just like a bunch of little rectangles in a grid, and we're all close-ups. There's not much body language that you can convey. There's not a lot of shoegazing or scanning the room or making eye contact with other people. If this is a work meeting or a seminar, that might be an important mode, but our static cameras don't allow that. So what that means is that, you know, we're stuck in this grid. We're still stuck in Alberti's grid. There's very few spontaneous interactions that this allows. I'm currently teaching 2 classes at university here in California, 45 students each. We kept those classes small for pedagogical reasons, but that's not that small. I can't see 45 faces at the same time on a screen. Many of them, of course, because people prefer not to be seen. They've all turned their cameras off, and they only turn their microphones on if I call on them. So, you know, it's a very passive control grid that we live with, that we work with in these grid aesthetics. Right? There's a waiting room that I have authority over, and I admit people to the inner sanctum. There is a breakout group, as if, you know, you're sort of breaking out from the grid that controls you. You know, the language that surrounds our video conferencing today really pushes that point, that it's sort of suspended between surveillance and a very low temperature communication. So I'm going to throw a French quote at you because academics sometimes are pretentious like that. But I'm also providing you the English version right away. In his famous essay about the control society, where he's sort of riffing on Foucauldian modes of analysis. And Foucault, of course, in his archaeology could be one of the people that media archaeology looks to for a research method. Deleuze points out, when Foucault invokes the notion of the diagram, it is in connection with our modern disciplinarian societies where power controls the whole field. If there is a model, it is that of the plague, which cordons off the stricken town and regulates the smallest detail. Now, that's a good translation into English, but I want to point out that in French, it doesn't say control or regulate, it says quadrillage. So, and that's not that quadrillage, it's not just a cordon, it's actually literally a grid. It's a screen of rectangles. So Foucault's analysis points out that the grid, the map, the surveillance, the geographical and architectural of countries, etc., is a system that allowed people to control the plague. And here we are dealing with the grid of rectangles that we use to control the COVID-19 and the plague that we're currently dealing with. And that's why I put the French quote here in there for you, so you see that the word used in French is actually quite literally referring to the media archaeology of the grid, of the thing that organizes the screen, that relegates each of you to a small section of the screen and controls what you can do on the screen. I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions because I just complained that Zoom doesn't allow for enough interactions. So let's try to go against that prediction and make room for some question or discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Very nice presentation and such a interesting group of images dealing with the fiction and the non-fiction. Since I heard you before explaining about the idea of the interface or the screen, it is interesting to look at these images and see how important it was to establish the idea of the screen, especially when you look at the movies, as sort of a magical instrument to build a relationship between two people, and the idea that the screen brings transparency to the process, and this is something that if we look at it from the Zoom perspective or what we're living now, somehow it looks like this idea still persists at the same time that people are managing, like putting some different background, or like you're doing right now, or maybe shutting down the video in case of the classes most of the time. So different strategies in terms of not giving up the transparency. It seems that the audio is the language that persists, bringing the idea of being present, of being live. And the other thing that I notice is that the devices that we're using right now, the applications that we're using right now, are usually into this idea of a conference of groups of people, and the devices that you showed us mostly work with the, let's say, the telephone idea, one-to-one. So at what point these things changed? Is that something has to do with something that came from the internet history in terms of chatting with text with many people at the same time, what is this group feeling came in terms of looking at the past references in this perspective. So the things that occurred to me, the importance of the screen and the idea of group versus one-to-one.
Yeah, really important points. When I look at media technologies of any sort, as you pointed out, I like to not just look at what they enable us to do, what is the affordance, but also any kind of restrictions. Not that restrictions are bad. Sometimes it's good to work with a restriction, to accept a limitation that can actually make us more creative. It can make us more expressive. Anybody who works with something where anything goes, where there are no rules and no restrictions, knows that that's not necessarily the most conductive, the most conducive channel. So that's one thing. Like, if we now are all spending our days, our working hours, and maybe some of our social hours on video conferencing interfaces, what does that allow us to do that we wouldn't be able to do without them? But also, what does it still not allow? Right? So, for instance, the point that if I'm teaching, which is only one potential use of video conferencing, I depend a lot on body language of a group. I depend a lot on feedback, acoustic feedback too, like the clearing of throats, or murmuring, or a little bit of laughter, or sounds of outrage, or whatever other feedback we might get from each other when we have a work meeting or a class or whatever. Much of that is stripped out of video conferencing, intentionally, because it's a distraction. Like the Champions League and Election Day, as you pointed out, we try to at least present focused participation, even if our attention is always competed for by multiple things. The interesting thing is that, as you point out, screens are often dividing attention, and for all I know, you could have 10 other things open on your screens right now. I have no way of knowing. I shared only a part of my screen, so I could have 10 other things open on my screen right now. Although I pretend to be fully present for you, there's a potential for cheating on that promise is enormous. Whereas even in the most poor long-distance phone connection, the voice always comes life-size, right? Even in the most compressed, poorly engineered telephone connection, we have enough representation of the bandwidth between 800 hertz and 4,000 hertz that even a very low-tech telephone allows me to recognize your voice, allows you to recognize my voice if we know each other even superficially, allows us to just tell apart different voices, and not just older or younger, or female, male, or excited, angry, happy, whatever. We pick up on a lot of nuance, probably more than people realize. It's a lot of unspoken signals. It doesn't even have to be verbalized. So that's a very, very reliable human connection. And if we don't have that, if we mute ourselves, or if we mute other people, as I do when I'm teaching, the default for the university is that everybody is muted. I admit people muted, right? I would never do that in a lecture hall. I would never do that if I have a business meeting. I don't ask people to be completely silent before they enter my office or enter my my sales meeting or whatever it might be. So there's a power, there's a dispositive at stake here that we just assume as natural, although it's not. Right? So that's something that media archaeology can excavate and make it very obvious that there's not like a teleological development that has led us naturally to doing what we are doing right now, and that this is the best way of doing it. It's pretty obvious to people who try to do their work, their learning, their socializing, keeping up with parents or with distant relatives, etc., that this is not necessarily an ideal format, that it does cut off certain forms that we thought were available in those kind of things, or should be available by now, but aren't, right? The fact that we try to supplement with a chat window so that you can have text as an alternative when there is a lagging connection, or when people don't have full control over their audio and video. The last point that you made is a distinction that classical media studies has already made often between media as a broadcast, right, one to many, the lecture situation, television, and a many-to-many medium. Like radio, technically at least, is a many-to-many medium, although the way we've implemented it it has become a broadcast medium, one-to-many. But technically, every radio receiver can also broadcast. Every computer that's connected to the internet can also be a server, right? So it's a many-to-many medium, which is why Metcalfe proposed that the more people participate, the more valuable that network. And we see that carried out, that promise, in social media, kind of spiraling to a more and more dominant use of the internet.
Peter, we have 2 questions in the chat. So you asked them. Luisa was talking about audio silence. You are talking about audio silence, and she completes her question with how can we think about it when you go back to presence, this relation between presence and audio, using video, be live, how we can think about it when we get back to being in presence of each other?
There are a lot of debates and collective decisions. I think they should be collective decisions. That would be my short answer to the question, if I understood it correctly, is that these should be negotiated and debated publicly. I gave you one local example. I told you I'm teaching 2 classes currently. They both have the same number of people in them. There's a little bit of overlap. Some people are taking both classes, but mostly they're two different groups. And because we are in this telecommunications situation, they're not all in the same time zone. They all attend ostensibly the same educational institution, but they can be in China, or they can be in Turkey. They can be in Africa. They can be in Norway. So under those circumstances, a lot of students have asked whether I can deliver the class asynchronously. Well, what that basically means is I turn myself into a series of YouTube videos, like we're doing here, right? And then we ask people to watch that on their own time. But it cuts off even more of the capability that we have. And the reason we set up education, and especially higher education, on the basis of debate, on the basis of interaction, is because we learn better if we can interrupt each other, if we can ask, if we can get feedback, if we can get corrections. If everything is canned, recorded, and we're just watching, it's less easy to get the right kind of attention from the audience, and it's less easy to calibrate exactly what people already know, what they don't know, what they disagree with, what they want to debate, etc. So the question of whether or not to do things in such a way that they can be watched conveniently in different time zones goes up against a trade-off. There's always trade-offs in these format questions. What if we don't do that? What is the upside for everybody? Yes, you have to be up and awake at an inconvenient hour, but you benefit not just from talking to one person, but from talking to everybody else, right? So the network effect of having 45 people talking to 44 people is that potentially much more valuable than just listening to one person.
And the other question is about the interface. Lolita asks if the complexity of the interface will interfere in the way users act in the Zoom?
We call it an interface. I don't know if the Portuguese word also has the face, front and center. And the interesting thing is, the more I look at the history of the PicturePhone or other media archaeological aspects of what goes into the formation that we now deal with, is that it's not really always about the face. And of course, talking heads on TV have had to learn how to, present themselves to a camera while wearing the appropriate mask. You want to demonstrate that you're being responsible, and that you talk to your interviewers in a healthy and respectful way, but it obscures your face. So interfaces like that, they're always opening up a possibility, but also foreclosing other possibilities. They're controlling what I can do. I'm trying to gesticulate. I'm using my hands. Yeah. My hands look very weirdly kind of large, and they have a ghostly trail there because of my virtual background. It's not good, but it's sort of instinctual for us if we're teaching, that we try to be emotive, that we try to express ourselves. And I found, that colleagues complain quite a lot that it's more exhausting to teach to a camera than it is to teach to people in a room, because of the effective labor that you have to put into trying to overcome the obstacle that is the interface, right? So again, I'm not saying that we're always trying to jump over a hurdle of technology. I'm all in favor of embracing certain restrictions and rules, and I see the creative potential there. And maybe in a few years, if we have to normalize Zoom or Teams or Jitsi or FaceTime or Messenger or whatever, and maybe if we don't get out of this mode of telecommunication entirely, if it becomes an extension of what we used to do with telephones and TV screens and other small portable screens, we will be better at expressing ourselves and understanding other people's expressions. In the same way that the transition from silent film to audio, film, sound film, calls for a different kind of acting, a different kind of dialogue, a different kind of editing rhythm. In the same way that television changed that again, especially MTV, music television, changed our acceptance of what the natural interface, that is my eyes, my ears, can process, right? In the end, we have to bring it down to a human scale. How much can my eye perceive? How long can a class go if it is, in this, desiccated, dried out kind of interface? How much can I share in multiple media, sound, videos, etc., to make it interesting, to keep an audience's attention without it becoming like a trivial attempt to be a clown, a television show, or whatever. We're still at work. So, what are the trade-offs? That's what's interesting to me. And some of the things some of the factors that contribute to what we're now coping with, what we're now dealing with, have roots, as Foucault and Deleuze pointed out, in 18th century visual media and in governance systems. And that's also a really important consideration when we think about what we do say and what we don't say on Zoom. A lot of my Chinese students are concerned that certain classes would include a discussion of politics, and they don't want to be in China or in a Zoom server that's hosted in China and be potentially recorded or surveilled as saying something that is critical of what's going on in Hong Kong or whatever it might be. So we have a different kind of context for these interactions, a different level of worry, global worries that constrain our freedom of speech, our potential for expressing critical debate.
Stuff?
Peter, I was wondering, in terms of what regarding this approach you did towards the relationship between past devices, or how the idea of communication long distance was pictured by movies or television series or other media. How uh, how does this look to you from your approach to media archaeology as method and theory? I know you are not an exclusive what is this part of looking at the past of the media? How do you look at that?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair challenge and observation, and even criticism that I hear in your comment. And it's true. I'm not a card-carrying media archaeologist, and my
You're welcome in the club, but
my understanding of its value, my understanding of the approach and the importance of the approach, for instance, for this kind of discussion, is that it's a corrective, right? It's a corrective, especially to the rhetoric that often attends digital culture, new media formats, where we don't have enough critical potential, critical distance from these new platforms, whether it's social media or new audiovisual interactions, or the flavor of the month, TikTok being politically contentious, etc. How do we wrap our minds around the fact that this is not just all new? So media archaeology is a way of pointing out that these things are not entirely new, that in fact video conferencing is an idea that has more than 100 years of technical history and a couple hundred years of imaginary history, or not history, archaeology, and that it doesn't come into being, it doesn't come to fruition just because somebody builds it and then that's how it is. They're competing modes. There are competing technical implementations, and there are competing values, right? So the big issue now, for instance, which you've heard me talk about before when I visited Brazil this year and 2 years ago, is a question of how reliable, how trustworthy those kinds of channels can be on the internet in general and on video conferencing in particular. Media archaeology can tell us a lot about what a secret is and how we communicate secrets, to my doctor, to my lawyer, to my loved one, to my business partner. And we also know that Zoom delayed for a very long time the promise that they had made of actually offering reliable end-to-end encryption. We know that Facebook and Google video conferencing do not offer the same level of technical assurance as that. And anytime that somebody raises that point, they're criticized as giving shelter to terrorists or to child abuse or to whatever terrible exceptions there might be, instead of showing that there are servers of this global network in different jurisdictions, and they might be vulnerable to different political pressures. There's also the issue of censorship, right? I already mentioned my Chinese students are particularly worried about that. But it could be any other country. Thailand has laws that make a certain kind of comments illegal, and you could be prosecuted if you criticize the royal family. If I happen to be in Thailand and I make such a comment, I'm subject to those laws. Some countries have begun, even in the United States, have begun to apply their laws globally instead of just domestically, copyright restrictions, etc. So to the extent that I just used clips from Blade Runner and from a Charlie Chaplin movie, if we put this up on YouTube, somebody is going to check whether this is a breach of copyright or not. I always maintain that for educational use in the United States and elsewhere, there's an exemption. Fair use allows me to use these things in a critical and comparative mode. There's also an allowance for parody, etc. But not everybody agrees on what we are allowed to do in these formats. And in fact, we should be using these formats to have disagreements rather than to have a safe space. And that's really the debate of the decade, I think.
Yeah. Camila asks in the chat about embodiment. She asks, what would be the role of the body as an operator and creator of images? Zoom, I believe. Not just
I don't know. We should crowdsource that question. We should get everybody to weigh in chat or in other ways. Or maybe a breakout group. Breakout from Zoom or from Facebook. And we should delete Facebook anyway. Sorry, Marcia. and discuss that in a group the size that we're comfortable discussing.
I put a translated version of Camila's.
Thank you. I just saw it.
If you'd like to take a.
It says, it seems that this look at the PicturePhone reinforces a desire of all forms of devices for immediacy. And yeah, that's sort of an old challenge to media studies. Are we actually mediating in the sense of providing critical distance? Or are we providing immediacy? Are we eliminating distance? Are we eliminating historical and geographical distance? And it's a little bit of both at all times, right? So, from the invention of writing to the newest technologies, they are very good at transcending time and space. And the value of a piece of information still kind of depends on its time and space. If I know the election results that everybody else only finds out in a few days, if I know them today, that's valuable, and I can go on Twitter and declare what's going to happen. If I only know the election results of the United States current election in 3 months, that's old news. If I know the value to somebody of a piece of information in an educational or business context, it has a lot to do with the temporal and geographical index. So we don't do away with time and space. We just deal with them differently. And different networks allow that to happen differently. Some networks do not intersect, right? So you could be a caribou on one side of a big gas pipeline in Alaska, and your desired mate could be 2 meters away, but you cannot hop under it or over it. Some networks actually prevent connections that we want to make. Some networks do not permit that we make connections with the people who might actually be our immediate neighbors in other ways. Right? So that's actually a criticism, not just of the example in the question, the Atari MindLink or other kind of things that allow us to connect with long, distant people. It comes at the expense or the cost of not being aware of what people immediately next to you are interested in. Right? So I can talk to my brother in Norway in real time, but I don't talk to the person living in the apartment next to mine. Is that a downside or an upside? It depends, right? MindLink, I can try to control devices. Does that exclude people? Of course, it's a very ableist kind of idea that those people who are able to use their fingers, twitchy fingers to control a video game console or a keyboard, or whose thumbs have fully adapted to the small screen so they can be texting and playing and sharing pictures. quickly as if they're born to do it, separates them from their grandparents who don't know how that works. To this day, since I've been on the internet since late '80s, since before the web was around, and I got used to being the person who explains to my parents how to do this, and I'm still doing it decades later. Right? It's not like they've had decades to come into the present and live with all of the things that we live with. But there's still a generational and ability differential here, and that's probably one of the smaller reasons why the PicturePhone did not fulfill the hopes of AT&T and Bell Labs. It's one aspect of why not everybody is very comfortable with what I'm doing right now, what you're doing right now. It assumes that we hear and see well enough to do this. It assumes that we are accepting enough of the way that we sound and look on a screen, without makeup or special effects software pulling the punch and making this more bearable. Maybe it's one reason why about 80% of my students hardly ever have their camera on. And when I do turn the camera on because I call on them, I sometimes see them in a car, in a parking lot. I see them in a workplace. I see them sitting in a bed with a pillow behind them, etc. There are many reasons why we don't want to show. There are many reasons, perhaps, why I don't want to show what my actual current background is. Right? So it's both masking who we are and performing for the screen, as Walter Benjamin observed already like a century ago. We have to maintain our humanity against, not just with, but also against the technology, and that's of course illustrated beautifully by the Chaplin film.
The idea of the window itself, we saw many videos of people saluting one another through buildings, through their windows, sort of making this paradox between being in this trapped in the technological window versus rediscovering these windows that we have through our neighbors, and that obviously that became famous because it went back to the window of the TV screen while we watch these stories unfold. And in that sense, there's this idea of trying to get back some sense of humanity in these times. Maybe in that sense, even broadcast television is sort of being more trusted in terms of the numbers of regarding the pandemic, of how many people are sick, how many people died, and also one McLuhan reversion is this idea of the old media, of the fact that people are trying to find ways of interacting face to face. And then, as we were talking before we started here on Facebook, that people are voting through mail, through, like, say, snail mail, right? In the United States, people are actually putting a letter and giving it to a mailman and saying, "This is my vote. Please make it go all the way." And that's very curious in terms of what we're living now, because on the other hand, we have all these expectations regarding artificial intelligence, robotics, bots, chatbots and stuff. So it's very interesting how we came to this intersection.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I voted that way. I voted by mail. I always do, partly because I used to travel quite a bit, and I don't necessarily always know that I can be present on a given day. Although we do know November 3rd is important every 4 years, but or the first Tuesday of November. I voted by mail also because we can make a useful distinction in many media channels, maybe not all of them, but many, between the data themselves, which in this case also should be confidential. I mean, we don't have to tell each other who we vote for. That's between you and your conscience, people say in America. But the metadata can be tracked. Right? So yes, it's true. I wrote this on paper with a pen. It has to be a black pen, not red or blue. I filled in certain rectangles by certain options, and I put it in an envelope. And the envelope now is being tracked. So I get emails or text updates. Right, so I have new media tracking of my old media channel. And I'm totally happy with the fact that metadata are open to inspection as long as the data themselves, the content, is protected, because in that channel it's appropriate. Right? The same thing is true of my phone calls, of my emails. The metadata are very easily tracked, not just by three-letter agencies, but also by telecommunications companies, by advertisers, etc. And it tells them a lot, who do I call, who calls me, who do I email, who emails me. That's a lot of information. It's personally identifying information in some ways. But if we can anonymize it by removing certain location data from it, etc., then I'm comfortable with that level of knowledge that I sort of freely give away about my communications in newer media or in older media. But the media archaeological index of this kind of discussion is that we should have the ability to use a channel in a confidential way. We should have the confidence in certain channels. And I don't know if people still have that confidence. Short of meeting in person in the dark, whispering, which you can maybe do in confessional if you're Catholic, or you can maybe do it with your mafia conspirators. But it's not always easy to do that with your lawyer, with your banker, with your doctor, or with your family members, etc., or business partners. Not everything has to be broadcast to the public. So there's a distinction between meta and the actual data. And speaking of meta, this is also a meta thing to do here, to talk about Zoom on Zoom, to talk about Facebook on Facebook. And that's something that the video examples that I showed do. They show on a large cinema screen the scale of the person, whether it's the engineer in Metropolis or the Chaplin character. And then you have this oversized head on a screen, as this screen on the screen, who has the advantage of size and media technological power over them. So it's media within media, and we've become very comfortable with understanding that these names sometimes are confusing. We still talk about film, even though we watch a film that is entirely done digitally, edited digitally, distributed digitally, and watched on a small screen. We talk about television, even though perhaps what I watch on my TV is not something that people would have recognized as TV in the 60s, etc. So sometimes there's this atavistic aspect in media discourse. And to come back to your earlier question, that's what I see as the virtue and the benefit of taking a media archaeological view. It's not the only access that I take, not the only way that I try to study what's at stake, but it does allow us to compare and to revive options that maybe we have already forgotten, or we've given up, that we've forgotten about. And say, this used to be part of the discourse, it used to be there, or to recognize that there are certain aspects of what we have accepted that maybe we shouldn't have accepted because they were not acceptable 100 years ago, they were not acceptable 50 years ago, they were not acceptable in the 1985, so why are they acceptable to us today? Were we just worn down? Were we just holding out for a lower price? Or are there other reasons to maybe push back and say, you know what, we can redesign this. We can design this in such a way that it actually serves all of the users rather than just the advertisers or whoever might hold the power in a given channel.
I was thinking, Peter, about this relation between secrecy and presence now in the internet. And because I have a lot of friends with doesn't have any picture, any photo of themselves in the internet, but now they must be online, they must show their faces because of Zoom. So there is this relation. If the I don't know if Zoom is always recording, or if the data is maybe accessible in any way, their face is now online. And we are talking about new generation of intelligence machines like machine learning that can make pictures of, can make people from faces on the internet. So there is this relation between secrecy and the image and presence now. I don't know, think about it.
Yeah, I mean, that goes along with a lot of other forms of reticence. Some, you know, some people might just be shy. Certainly, a number of people are paranoid. Some people are paranoid with reason. Some people are paranoid without reason, or they don't. They might be paranoid for good reasons, but they don't articulate them that way. It has, however, almost come to the point where you're more conspicuous for the absence rather than the presence of your face or other information about you, to the extent that telephones want to be unlocked not with a code but with facial recognition, to the extent that facial recognition cameras are tracking us in many large cities. And not being in the system, not having a social media exhaust trail actually makes you more conspicuous, more suspicious than having an average number of tweets or Facebook posts or Instagram likes, etc. So, you know, it's a strange game that we're playing with participation or withholding participation, and that's why I like the idea of telling the history of communication also through the history of secrecy, because I think there's always a balance of sharing and withholding. That's what makes up a personality. That's what makes up our polite interaction with each other. Even in the closest, you know, family context, there are certain things that I do behind a closed door that I don't say to everybody's face. And the further away we are from a very personal relationship, the more of these social filters we see. And social media have sort of undone some of those. And there's been an inducement to overshare because it's valuable to advertisers, it's valuable to aggregators, but the value to individuals hasn't really been proven. And I think we're going to see a similar kind of debate around the normalization of Zoom or Teams or FaceTime. Who benefits the most? And that's the question. Personally, at home, I can say that very clearly the pandemic is a conspiracy of the dogs, because they benefit the most. I don't leave them alone at all, ever. They're immune. They don't get infected with COVID-19. They get to have interactions with me at any time. They get to bully me into feeding or walking or whatever else it is that the caninocrats need. So, you know, it's very clearly, personally, I think, a conspiracy of dogs.
Very nice. Marcio, I guess we don't have anything new on the chat, Facebook?
No, we don't.
Okay. We'll approach in almost 1 hour and 20 minutes. Very nice, Peter. I think we, in this period, we were able to get into this idea of discussing the room that we're into right now. and looking at it from the so-called media archaeological perspective, which is one of the most interesting topics in terms of trying to define it. But probably one of the good guesses, in my opinion, is that it's a field that it's open to methodological interventions from a multi-perspective approach, or a multidisciplinary approach. And the way that you did that, approaching a content media look at how films were picturing the idea of a picture phone, how the industry behaved, and how the other, let's quote unquote, invisible forces acted on it. I think it's a very, very good example of how we can build a framework from let's say, a very day-to-day thing now for everybody that is working into the educational field or research field or any kind of field, as a matter of fact, of looking at the screens and trying to figure out how we're going to go from there, right?
Yeah. And what our alternatives might be. The more boxed in we feel by the grid of these screens, and the more they proliferate, the more they take over our waking hours. Small rectangles and bigger rectangles, and lots of small rectangles on the bigger rectangles. Thank you very much for having me. I was flattered to be included in your series. Thank you, Marcio. Thank you, Gustavo. And thank you for all of the questions that came also through the chat. Take care, and let's hope for the best.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully we won't mention names right now because we don't know what side Facebook is, right? Probably the side of the winner, whoever that's going to be.
Well, we're almost close to the hour where the East Coast of the United States is going to be cautiously tallying results. So I'm going to devote the rest of my day to the doom scrolling and TV channel hopping that comes with the political games that we play.
All right, very good. Thank you once again. Marcio would like to.
No, thank you very much, Peter. Fantastic.
And as we are telling people on the chat room, and we told them before, we're going to subtitle afterwards the recording of the video, and then to make it available. And I think that's good science, right? Open and available,
right.
Even though sponsored by Facebook and Zoom. Not that we asked them for it, but they're sponsoring anyway. Bom, a gente está encerrando então aqui a conversa de hoje com o Peter. Quero agradecer mais uma vez o professor Peter Krapp da Universidade de Califórnia Irvine pela presença aqui conosco, pelo diálogo. Nós vamos legendar, né, esse vídeo assim que ele ficar disponível aí para a gente baixá-lo. E esperamos com isso poder compartilhar novamente esse conteúdo importante e também receber o retorno de vocês ao longo do ano, né, em tantas ocasiões, foram 5 encontros, e acho que a gente está num processo de entender, assim como a gente está tentando entender o papel de todas essas plataformas e essas telas, qual a melhor forma de tocar nesse assunto que para a gente é importante e para muitos pesquisadores também, né, Márcio?
É isso aí. Não, foi bem legal, e acho que dando aí uma palavrinha da arqueologia das mídias, a gente está avançando no debate, acho que é algo que está no ponto aí para a gente começar a discutir no Brasil também. Acho que ter esse espaço para a gente se encontrar aqui, né, Gustavo? Encontrar com o pessoal que gosta, que nos acompanha, tem sido muito produtivo. Enfim, voltaremos ano que vem, né, com novas ideias, novos convidados.
Exatamente.
É isso.
Procurem nos seguir aí nas redes para também seguirem com novos conteúdos e novas ideias aí para a gente seguir nesse processo.
Isso.
Valeu, gente.
Valeu,
muito
gente.
Obrigado aí
Obrigado,
pela
Peter.
participação de todos. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.